A year into Russian President Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine, Russia has suffered a huge strategic defeat. Ukraine has scored a big strategic win, and the West has shown a level of resolve, solidarity, and coherence that few could have predicted. Welcome everyone. In today's video, we're going to tell you Russia and Ukraine conflict is finished. The fight rages on, with no end in sight. Neither side is willing to bargain. Both are planning massive offensives in the near future. In recent months, neither side has made a significant breakthrough that might alter the course of the war, whereas Russia's failure to win in a blitzkrieg spurred many predictions of an impending Ukrainian victory. Recent analysis has focused on a stalemate. But before we proceed the further video, if you're new to this channel, remember, go ahead and hit the bell icon to subscribe, so you won't miss the informative videos we will upload in the future. Ukrainians, who have tasted success on the battlefield and are unified in their desire for justice and vengeance, will not accept a land for peace deal. Compromise is not an option for Putin, whose war it is principally. After the humiliation of his failed campaign to achieve his maximalist goals, when he started the war, it was not an existential threat to him, but it is today. He has bet his entire presidency on it, and he must win. He's gearing up for a long war. The correlation of forces. The correlation of forces benefits Russia in a long war. Russia's GDP in 2021, the final pre-war year, was 9 times that of Ukraine. Following a 2.4% contraction in 2022, the Russian economy is expected to begin rising again, albeit slowly. In 2023, the Russian economy has been harmed by successive waves of extraordinary sanctions, undermining its long-term growth prospects. Countries, however, adapt, as Russia is already doing, with alternate supply chains, lower tech equivalents, and jerry-rigged substitutes for components that are no longer available. It is selling record amounts of oil to India and China, as well as finding new consumers and acquiring a fleet of tankers in order to avoid Western sanctions. Russia had a pre-war population that was 3 times that of Ukraine. Russia's land remains intact, and unlike Ukraine, it is not constantly under attack. Its defense facilities are open round the clock, and Putin has promised to spend whatever it takes to keep his troops supplied. Ukraine has effectively become a ward of the EU and NATO, regardless of its people's bravery and perseverance, its capacity to battle unrests on the West's military and financial help. It is under constant Russian bombardment. Its economy has sustained severe harm. Its GDP is expected to fall by 1/3 by 2022. The cost of reconstruction is expected to reach $1 trillion. Millions of its people have been uprooted, many of them indefinitely. Russia has experienced tremendous casualties, with an estimated 200,000 people killed or injured. Ukraine's losses are believed to be 100,000 people. While Russian losses are frequently documented, the scale of Ukrainian losses is less generally understood. It is a greater loss for Ukraine than for Russia. These figures do not benefit Ukraine, as some who argue for an immediate significant increase in Western support to Ukraine acknowledge, in order for it to yield decisive results swiftly and force Putin's hand to bargain on terms favorable to Ukraine. This strategy appears to be founded on both hope and experience. Over the last year, the West has provided substantial military aid to Ukraine, from drones and tanks to artillery rounds and real-time targeting data. The US and its allies have provided Ukraine's armed forces with increasingly lethal technology and support. With each new weapon system delivered to Ukraine, aspirations for a breakthrough and a dramatic reversal in the war's direction mount. However, the Ukrainian army has yet to achieve a significant breakthrough. What next? The next phase of the fight is expected to be extremely difficult for Ukraine. Offensive operations are intrinsically more difficult than defensive operations. According to military observers, the Ukrainian army will have to conduct them against a Russian army that has had time to recoup from the setbacks it experienced last summer and fall and dig in to prepare for the much-anticipated Ukrainian onslaught. Recent reports that Ukraine is running out of artillery shells to defend against the latest Russian offensive foreshadow the difficulties it will face once it launches its own offensive operation in the country's south and, as a result, needs to expend ammunition at a much higher rate to press the attack. Even if a Ukrainian onslaught is successful, despite the expected challenges and huge losses suffered by the Ukrainian army, the war will not be over. A Ukrainian breakthrough in southern Ukraine might put Russia's grip on Crimea in jeopardy. The peninsula, which Russia unlawfully annexed in 2014, is Putin's most significant geopolitical achievement. Its destruction would not be an acceptable alternative for him, let alone a bargaining tool in negotiating the terms of the war's termination. The takeover of Crimea was widely supported and embraced by the vast majority of Russians. Unlike in Donbass, where war has persisted since 2014, Ukraine never militarily contested Crimea after its takeover, albeit it was not recognized as part of Russia. During the 8 years preceding the escalation of Russia's conflict against Ukraine, on February 24, 2022, the Russian population had supported the Kremlin's slogan Krim Nash. The danger of losing Crimea would add validity to Putin's claims that the conflict is being conducted in defense of the nation in the eyes of the Russian people. Over the last year, there has been a lot of conjecture about Russian red lines and what steps Ukraine and its Western supporters would take to cross them. The sinking of the Moskva, the blowing up of the Crimea Bridge, and strikes deep into Russian territory were all accompanied by speculation about where Russia's red lines were and what would eventually cause a large retaliation or perhaps force Putin to launch nuclear strikes against Ukraine. Putin did escalate, ordering a partial mobilization and launching an air assault on Ukrainian cities and crucial infrastructure. However, because to Ukrainian fortitude and creativity, the consequences of this escalation proved to be less devastating than anticipated, even after Russian leaders turned to nuclear threats. Even if those alleged red lines had been broken, the worst-case scenario, a direct attack on a NATO country or a nuclear strike, did not occur. This fueled claims that Russia had no red lines and that the West imposed them on itself, as well as discussion over why Putin had not yet ordered nuclear strikes. Nobody knows what might compel Putin to use nuclear weapons. He is undoubtedly aware of the significance of such a move, including the possibility of a direct NATO military reaction. But if there is one scenario that could persuade him to take it, the risk of losing Crimea is a strong contender among many others. It would be a humiliating defeat, not just a defeat. Aside from whether Kyiv would be motivated to pause its offensive with a significant symbolic win within grasp, the loss of Crimea or the risk of losing it would undoubtedly force Putin to resort to nuclear weapons. As a result, a Ukrainian breakthrough in the country's south is just as likely to spark a rapid escalation of the war as it is to stop it. Same goals, different strategy. Putin began the conflict with the intention of conducting a brief and decisive campaign. Russia was expected to win easily. A year later, he is betting on the opposite, waging a long war against Ukraine, capitalizing on Russia's strength, sturdy economy, and relative immunity from reprisal. Victory on the battlefield has eluded them. His next best alternatives are a counteroffensive in Donbass, a terror campaign against Ukrainian cities and towns, and the destruction of the country's infrastructure. According to Putin, this is a plausible approach for the next phase of the fight. He confronts little domestic pressure from a passive public that mainly approves of his handling of the situation in general, is supportive of the war, and accepts the narrative employed by the Kremlin to justify it. The Russian leader is most likely banking that Ukraine will finally be unable to withstand a true war of attrition, and that the West would lose patience and withdraw its backing for Ukraine. A year into the war, the fundamental result is that Putin has accomplished exactly what he intended to avoid. Assuming his rationale for the war is taken at its value, he has constructed a country on Russia's doorstep that is united in its hatred for Russia, resolute in its resistance to the invasion, and determined to fight it at any cost. One of Putin's main criticisms before the war was that NATO was flooding Ukraine with weaponry. Those pre-war supplies were insignificant in comparison to the quantities of superior weaponry sent to Ukraine by NATO allies to combat Russian aggression. Ukraine's military is capable and battle-tested. It has decided to join NATO, and even if this does not happen soon, it has already established tight security connections with the alliance, which is actively exploring what security arrangements it can offer Ukraine to boost its defensive and deterrence capacities against Russia. Putin has succeeded in transforming his war into Russia's war. He'll leave the stage one day. His heir will have to deal with the consequences of his control over Russia. This will include an unsustainable scenario on the country's southwest border. If the war is done by then, regardless of the conditions on which it ends, it is hard to envision Ukraine reconciling with Russia in 10, 20, 30, or even ever, after the pain and devastation wreaked on the country by Putin's aggression. Any future Russian leader is unlikely to tolerate a hostile Ukraine entrenched in the Western camp and effectively turned into its armed outpost on Russia's doorstep, threatening Russia's access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. If not a war, this is almost certainly going to turn into a long-term, tense geopolitical standoff, the leading edge of a broader standoff between Russia and the rest of Europe. As a result, Putin's war will become Russia's war. The West's. In this battle, Russia has suffered numerous strategic failures. Some believe it has permanently lost its position as Europe's leading energy supplier. Russia's leverage over Europe has dwindled substantially. Its status as a resurgent military force has suffered. Its position in the Baltic was severely weakened when Sweden and Finland announced preparations to join NATO. Its once impenetrable anti-access and area denial bubble above Crimea has been breached, turning it to yet another Potem village. NATO has been re-energized, and a new consensus has emerged. The conflict has put the final nail in the coffin of Europe's old, pre-2014 security paradigm, when it was still feasible to cling to the vestiges of the post-Cold War security system. If the Kremlin is serious about rebuilding its soft power, it will take decades, if not generations. However, Russia's losses do not directly convert into wins for the US and its allies. It is tempting to conclude that the war currently being waged on Ukrainian territory benefits the United States and Europe. Their major adversary is being weakened, while the West only expends treasure. Ukraine is doing all of the fighting, while Western militaries learn valuable lessons from the battlefield. The NATO alliance has received the much-needed wake-up call, and the war has effectively removed one great power from competition. However seductive this cold-blooded rationality may be to some, it misses the realities of a long conflict in Europe, as well as the moral issue of professing to wage an arm's-length war against Russia, with only Ukrainian lives at stake. It ignores the risk of escalation, even if it is not nuclear, and the likelihood of NATO directly joining the conflict. Despite its Churchillian ring, the notion that the West can simply provide Kyiv with the instruments to complete the job is neither anchored in history or reality. Great Britain could not do the job alone when Churchill begged for us arms in February 1941. It took 4 years to complete the task when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union and the United States entered the war later that year. And this is still true now, given Russia's significant advantages over Ukraine in a long battle of attrition. Worse, Russia's military stature has declined while its reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable neighbor armed with nuclear weapons has grown. Neither the US nor its NATO partners are willing to be drawn directly into this conflict. As the conflict approaches its second year, the United States and its allies are left with few options other than to increase military support and hope for the best. It is not ethically right to fight Russia to the death, but it is also not right to tell Ukrainians what they should accept in their righteous conflict. They will not accept a land-for-peace bargain, especially since it is unlikely to provide them the kind of stable, long-term peace they require and deserve. They would be constantly threatened by further Russian aggression. Russia does not appear to be willing to make a deal either. Ukraine's negotiating terms with Russia, restoration of 1991 borders, reparations, and war crimes tribunals amount to a demand for unconditional capitulation. Acceptance of these terms by Russia is not even a remote possibility. Having repeatedly committed to back Ukraine for as long as it takes, the US and its allies have effectively assigned the burden of defining the war's objectives to the Ukrainian government. Even while American and Ukrainian objectives are not completely aligned, any suggestion that US goals should be anything other than complete Ukrainian success and complete Russian submission is certain to elicit accusations of treason from multiple sources. The battle might end in one of three ways: a stalemate, a Ukrainian victory, or a Russian victory. The first scenario, in effect, becomes a perpetual war, akin to the current impasse on the Korean Peninsula. The second possibility is the risk of a significant escalation by Russia, which might lead to NATO becoming actively involved in battle. The third option also bears the risk of a direct NATO-Russia clash, as the possibility of Russia triumphing on the battlefield may prompt calls for NATO to intervene to preserve Ukraine. That's all for today's video. The first scenario, forever war, is the path of least resistance with the fewest immediate risks. However, betting on a stalemate without considering the other two possibilities would be a poor strategy. Don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos from our channel. Thanks for watching and see you all soon.